first of all, I just want to say I've like got to watch a little bit of like some of your stuff online, whether it's podcast interviews or TED Talks or your documentary.
Right.
And the first thing is just like being struck by like your openness and like your
Mm.
ability to like talk about something that is so relatable for people and like so healthy to hear. Because
Mm.
like when you hear other people like articulate so well like this arc of like growth and like spirituality and like this evolution, this
Wow.
change, like it just so makes you feel like I'm not crazy, other people feel this way. You
Oh, that
know.
makes me so happy to hear. I feel like there are so many people that are on that journey. I mean, I think it was probably happening all around me all the
Yeah.
time, but I was in a space in the past where I couldn't acknowledge it as beautiful. I just viewed it as something dangerous and scary.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that the things are changing, but it feels like there's all these stories around me that are unfolding and I'm just able to appreciate it. You know, even if people are heading in different directions than I would go, it's this ability to just appreciate that, you know, evolutionary kind of process and growth and shifting. So,
Yeah, you know, it's so I feel like a lot of connection to your story and a lot of overlap in that. Oh, I grew up in a very West Michigan area. It's very religious, very
right.
Christian, and I grew up in a megachurch and like come from like family that's all like pastors and
Wow.
lovely, lovely world in West Michigan, but also just very like insular and very like in its own bubble, and so. Also, growing up and coming out gay in my like very late 20s, 29,
Mm,
and walking through that process of like coming out, it's just there's so much overlap of like
yeah.
wrestling with your beliefs and like wrestling with your point of view, and that
Right.
it's such a for me it was a long process, and it's still
Yeah,
ongoing, and so to
for
connect
sure.
and hear a little bit about your process of like. Well, take us back, Josh. For those who don't know you, you got well known for a book you published right when you were
Yeah.
21,
Hmm.
and it was called "I Kissed Dating Goodbye."
That's right. Yeah. You're wanting me to complete the story. I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, you're
Well,
telling it really well.
I don't want to tell your
Go for
story.
it. Yeah, I like you grew up in a really, you know, loving Christian home. It was all that I knew. Um, I embraced that as a teenager and wanted to radically and passionately, you know, serve Jesus.
Hmm.
And I Kissed Dating Goodbye was a very particular expression of wanting to honor God in this part of my life that had been a source of, you know, at the time I would call it temptation and struggle,
Uh-huh.
you know, because I had a girlfriend and we were doing things we shouldn't be doing. And the big message from the church and from my parents and, you know, from the Christian culture was save sex for marriage.
Hmm.
And I was, you know, not going in the right direction in regard to that. And so I kind of had this, you know, second come to Jesus moment where it was like, I need to honor him with my love life. I need to honor him. And, you know, when it comes to how I relate to girls. And that ended up leading to this book, which was my story of saying, let's be really committed to God's way. And not just if we're not going to have sex, we need to back way up. You know, we need to get far from the edge of the cliff. And we shouldn't even be dating. You know, we shouldn't be putting ourselves in contexts that lead to temptation and compromise. And so I really just kind of popularized and expressed as like a young person all these ideas that were percolating in the Christian homeschool movement, in kind of different parts of evangelicalism where parents were trying to figure out what to do with their horny teenagers. And so
Yes.
that was I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And it ended up becoming, you know, very popular and sort of catapulting the ideas of what are now described as purity culture into, you know, a more mainstream discussion.
Yeah. You grew up homeschooled too, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly. Homeschooled my whole life. Never went to
It's
school.
it's such a breed of people. Sometimes I'll see some kids and they'll be homeschooled. And I'll be like, I know you're homeschooled. I could just tell. I could
You
tell by
can just
the
tell.
jean dress gave it away.
That's so
Yeah, I
funny.
had a lot of friends that grew up homeschool and grew up in that religious environment. It's also very interesting too because like, man, like it sounds like as a 21-year-old, your heart's in the right place, right?
Mm.
You and all you did was just up the ante, right?
Right. Up the
Of
ante is a good way
like,
to put it. Yeah.
if this is being moral or pure or saving sex, let's do even better, you know.
Right.
And so
Exactly.
it's like, man, so many of us, maybe especially when we're younger too, we strive so hard, and we're like to be like zealous and and get it right. And I feel like sometimes the harder you swing, the harder you whiff, right?
No, and it's interesting because I think that the people that I talk to, it's the people that were so sincere and committed that gave themselves in such an intense way, not just in regards to sexuality, but just into religion in
Yep.
general.
Yep.
Like, yeah, I mean, and this could be applied to a different setting. It could be applied to the company you work for. It's like the more you put your heart into it, the more you
Yeah.
believe in the vision, the more you buy in. When it lets you down, it's like the greater the heartbreak,
Yes.
you know? And so I think that you're right. I mean, I was kind of in this space of upping the ante and saying, let's be serious. And I think there's something about when you're young. I think it's easy to be self-righteous.
Sure.
I think there's an arrogance there, that just says, well, these past generations, they didn't try hard enough,
Yeah.
or you're looking at other Christians and you're like, you know what, they're just not committed. And so there's an energy there that, you know, it's like there's something sincere, but then there's also something, I think dangerous
Hmm.
and self-righteous about that energy sometimes, at least for me. I'll speak for myself.
So, Josh, it's kind of interesting to like hear how like there. I mean, as it was for me, like the unfolding of how like your belief systems change and how it gradually changes. Did I hear that like maybe in like 2010 you're already like, hey, you know what, this book, I'm already kind of like stepping back from it and I'm making some changes, and then you continue to kind of evolve your thinking even after that point.
Yeah, I would say that was the time when some realizations were dawning, but I was definitely not like stepping back from the
I
book. I
see.
I think what was happening at the church, my church at that time where I was pastoring, is that there was a lot that was falling apart and a lot that was being revealed as unhealthy in the church
Mm,
culture. And
yeah.
so that was the beginning of me starting to realize, wait a second, my book's, connected to that. The thinking of my book is connected to a church culture that elevates secondary issues and says, if you don't do these things, then you're not really passionate about God. You're not really, serious. And so that can include things like, at least in our church, homeschooling was one of those things, not dating was one of those things, daughters, not going to college, you know, wives not working but being,
Wow.
homemakers. I mean, it was
Yeah.
that very conservative kind of mindset. And even if it wasn't, carved in stone and written in the church mission statement, it was part of the culture. And so the bad fruit of that began to come out in a lot of different ways in our church and in other sister churches. And that was a very disillusioning time for me. I was trying to be a part of the leadership of keeping things together, but I was starting to see like what has been built here is not good.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of seeing that my book was connected to that. But it took a long time
Yep.
before I followed through with the process of actually digging into the details of the book, what's really wrong with it. And I honestly, I I mean, my church was exploding, so I was preoccupied, but
Yeah.
it was also just psychologically such a painful thing to consider. It's like I kept putting it off.
Yeah. So that catalyst of seeing how like emphasis on maybe the wrong things and how it
Hmm.
manifests in the community and in your church. is kind of what got you kind of questioning some of the beliefs you had or were holding.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's very interesting because, in a way, I feel very grateful growing up gay, even though I've had to be in the closet for a long time, because it was a
Mm,
constant catalyst for me to be like, I always have to wrestle with this aspect of how this jives with Christianity. And so it
interesting.
gave me, I feel like sometimes, in a religious circle or specifically in the Christian circle, you can, kind of like put on the back burner some issues that just don't quite jive or don't just quite feel right,
Yeah.
And you could just be like, cool, but collectively, I'm going to grab onto everything. And I'm a Christian, so I believe all these things, right? And then I'm not going to think a lot about some other topics that just don't feel right. And
Exactly.
because I grew up gay, I couldn't really put that on the back burner.
That
And
makes
so
so much
and
sense.
so it was such a catalyst for me to want to have questions and examine my beliefs, which I'm very grateful for. Even though the process was challenging, I wouldn't change it for the world. The end result of getting to have that experience and come out and meet my husband and
Wow.
it's such a valuable experience.
And how old were you when you had that awareness? You knew you were gay and you were in the Christian context.
Man, I would say, boy, there's almost like a mental admitting it to yourself sort of thing that I think happens
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
for anyone who's scared about being gay. And I think when I was 12 or 13, I kind of admitted it to myself, okay, I am struggling with this, struggling.
Yeah, of course.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I knew for a long time. And that process, it switched from even you know, as I got into my 20s, not feeling necessarily slowly losing the feeling of shame or it's bad that I'm gay,
Mm,
to even then staying in the closet because I felt fraudulent about lying to people, and then wanting to turn the tide felt that felt embarrassing, where I had come to terms with being gay, but I hadn't come to terms with the fact that I was lying to people and wanted to address it.
yeah.
And not to mention too, my family being very religious too, there's a lot of stakes to lose your family or to
Major
lose
disruption,
to lose
right?
your
Yeah.
community. Yeah. Um,
Well, I think, I mean, it's so helpful to hear what that was like for you. I think that's always the two parts of, that we have to deal with is like the inner opposition to kind of embracing who we really are.
mhm.
But then there's always the outward opposition to actually embracing who we are,
Yeah.
whether that comes from family, religious community, culture at large. It's like the expectations that other people have of you is this other, battle that you have to fight.
Yep.
And those don't always happen right at the same time.
Right.
But it's so interesting because when I mean, I'm skipping ahead a little bit in the story, but the moment where I it came in phases. I ended up recognizing the book was harmful and apologizing for that. Um, Recognizing I didn't want to be a pastor anymore
Hmm.
and letting go of that whole, persona and identity. And then behind the scenes, my marriage was ending,
Hmm.
and the point at which I and my ex-wife shared that was kind of another layer of letting go of people's perception and view of us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that kind of was the next domino to fall, was saying, actually, I'm not believing in the same way. Like my views of God are not the same. I don't know that I can't really call myself a Christian. You know, and and speaking that out into the world, I could have just kind of kept that hidden.
Yeah.
But when I went through that process, the kind of metaphor and experience that had so much resonance with me was my gay friends who,
Mm.
described that coming out process.
Yeah.
And it was like, that was the storyline that I was like, oh my gosh, you understand how, traumatic that can be, and how this, just speaking of your reality, your truth, can be so disruptive to relationships and to family, and it carries with it this potential for rejection.
Yeah.
And that's just an incredibly difficult moment to be in, but also so freeing at the same time.
Yes.
So
100%. It's very interesting. I want to talk to you a little bit about this, but I've always felt like in Christian culture, like, and here's the thing, I love my evangelical Christian friends and family, and they're awesome, and like they like kick butt in so many different ways.
that's true. It's so true.
But one of the things that I wrestled with when I identified as a Christian and evangelical Christian, and with that group, would be it almost felt as if you weren't allowed to be truthful or honest. That that if there was something that would give you pause or questions, whether it's a theological thing or the way a belief the group has, you weren't really supposed to be honest about it. And in fact, I even heard it sometimes like said, like in Christian circles, like, oh, if you're saved because you'll know that you know that you know. And it's like, so the very fact that if you doubted that you knew, or you're like, oh, I'm not sure, like some of these, like that in and of itself meant you weren't saved. So it's like you would have to almost pretend like you knew things, or like you didn't have questions. And it's almost the feeling of being able to question anything itself feels like it's off limits and taboo in Christian circles.
I think that's true. The thing that I think is interesting is I think that that's true of almost any group that you end up identifying with.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes.
It's maybe more pronounced and defined, the dogma of Christianity, but I feel like every group has its own dogma,
Yeah.
where you once you join in, you're aware, if I raise this thought,
Yes.
if I, say this, my friends are going to be like, are you okay? And what are you doing? So I think that's the thing that I'm just realizing as I step outside of the church, is that same impulse to judge and exclude based on, having a certain set of beliefs can still be there in a lot of different settings.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the whole discussion with, cancel culture and those types of things. It's like, obviously there are things that need to be censored, excuse me, and spoken against, and accountability for people who are in power, who misuse power and harm others, and so on. But there's also, I think, in lots of different spaces, this fear of, can you ask certain questions? Can you voice certain opinions? Do we want to create an environment where anybody has the power to say, if you think that, we'll shut you down? Yeah. And what I think is so ironic about how Christians are people, I mean, like conservative Christians, and I'm kind of mixing them in with the, Republicans and so on, which they are very mixed in, that are so upset about cancel culture, is if you're in the evangelical church, that we were the original cancel culture, right? I mean, that's what excommunication is. That's what church discipline is. Yeah. But also the church was constantly doing the cancel culture game. If Disney had a, gay pride day, then boycott Disney, shut down. You know what I mean? Like that was the impulse. Right? And so I just think it's a little bit ironic that they're so upset about it.
Yeah, man, you're exactly right. It's that membership to a club. It's so, well, first of all, it feels so antithetical to like what you would be trying to do from a religious point of view to begin with. But we're all doing it, And this idea that like who's in the club and who's not in the club is just like, we should all be just like, hey, these are the best ideas. I've even thought about this way about like, if you truly believed that like God was sending people to hell and taking some people to heaven. Sometimes I've heard, people be like, well, at least we got the good news, and like, at least we know, right? And we're going to be okay. And it's like, well, if that was truly the case, like, you'd be pulling people aside. You'd be like, hey, listen, like, you have to believe this. Like,
Yeah.
Even if you don't think, God's good, or like, like him sending to people to hell is good, just say you believe it. And, because like we should all be in this together about like, let's try to like find
You're
the
saying
right path.
if you actually hold to a belief in an eternal hell, then you would be spending all of your time and energy trying to rescue people from that.
Even if you
Is that what you're
believe,
saying?
yeah, and I would say even still, if you believe conceptually that made like God a non-good or benevolent God,
Yeah.
you would still be like, hey, best practice, like we have to abide by this because let's all take care of each other. But there's so much that's like some vibes I get sometimes from the religious is like, we got it, like we
Yeah.
know the truth, like we're saved, we're okay. But it should be the exact opposite of like
Yeah.
hey, this is what we're dealing with. Let's go.
Well, I saw this is such a funny sentence, but I saw a TikTok by Abraham Piper, who is John Piper's son, who, like his dad, is a very insightful thinker, but he doesn't identify as a Christian anymore.
Mhm.
And he kind of picks apart a lot of the fallacies and inconsistencies of religion and just thought in general. Very entertaining, very insightful guy on TikTok. Um, but he had a post that he did that was basically saying you can't believe in a literal eternal hell and live consistently and actually carry that idea and belief, because if you really believed, there's no activity that you could be engaging in except trying to witness and evangelize, because anything is a waste of time, a distraction. Eating dinner with your family, you should be using that money to go try to reach the lost. Like, I don't think the human mind can fully carry and grasp this idea that all these people are being sent to hell for forever, who don't even have the chance to hear the gospel, kind of a thing. Like, you can't really hold that. And every once in a while, someone will pop up who is trying to kind of live that consistently, and they're the people that go off to the mission field and give everything to go and try and serve in that way. Or they're the guy preaching on the street corner that you're just like, that person is so weird and so messed up or whatever. Yeah. And I think that's an example of how all beliefs have different places that you bump up against, that it's almost impossible to live completely consistently with your worldview. Yeah. And that's not just Christians. I think that's true of secular people. I mean, like, you give up the hope of eternal life and heaven and there being a God who has a purpose for all things. If you try to just like really live into that reality and that it's all meaningless, that you just walk around depressed all the time.
Yeah.
You'll just kill yourself today, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense in which we all are kind of like not being completely consistent,
right,
with our beliefs and the full expression of those. And that's where I just wish there was an ability for people in all camps to be more empathetic,
yes,
to be more gracious, to recognize what, none of us really have it all together here. And I think that's what's so frustrating about evangelical Christians, or just Christians in general, is that they don't have that ability at times to meet other people halfway, to say, you believe differently, I'm not completely consistent, there's a beauty in our humanity, we're all trying, all religions are an attempt to find purpose and community, and so on. It's, we have the way, the truth, and the life, and that self-righteous, well, you guys are just bummer for you. And that's what's so heartbreaking, I think.
Josh, and I think you like hit it too, where it's just like part of it is being able to just be willing to admit, like, I don't know for certain.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Whether,
like, we should all be able to say that, right?
We should all be able to say that.
But Christianity falls apart if you say that. Yeah. At least a certain brand of Christianity falls apart.
It
like,
sure does.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And there's like, that honesty of like, I don't know, like I'm gonna like do my best, I'm gonna try to follow these things, but like it really would shift the dynamic for us in all the groups we form, whether it's the Christian or atheist
Yeah.
or left or
Yeah.
right or blah blah blah, to just have that vulnerability of like, I don't know for certain, hey, this, I'm gonna lean this way, I'm gonna lean
Yeah.
into this, but
Right.
it's that staunchness of like, I'm certain, that becomes like that manifests so problematically when you start getting into the
Hmm.
particulars.
It's true. Well, the thing about it is you even mentioned this earlier about, you know, it's antithetical to religion to kind of have this we're in and other people are out. But actually, that kind of we're in the club and you aren't mentality is the very thing that appeals to people
Right.
to join the religion,
Yes. Okay.
you know?
Yep.
And so the kind of like if you lined up five different options of religion and four of those were the vulnerable kind that you're saying, where they're saying, you know what, we don't have all the answers. We're not totally certain. We just want to, be kind to others. We want to be friends with these four other options. And you had one option that was like, we have all the answers. If you're not with us, you're going to burn. And we've got every, direction for how you should live your life. I guarantee you that one is the one that's going to spread faster.
It's the most appealing for sure.
And even though there's like an ugliness to it, even though a lot of people can look at it and say that's dangerous, that's bad, it's the one that's going to spread because it gives people a sense of security.
Yep.
It gives answers to why the world is the way it is, and it rewards evangelism. In other words, there is a huge motivation to give financially, to give
Yes.
your
Yes.
time and your life, and to go to the ends of the earth to
to grow the
spread it.
group.
And
Yep.
the other four don't have that motivation.
You're right. Yeah, it's a feature. It's a feature of religion that will, I guess, always kind of cause it to lean that way to claiming certainty, right? Or at
Yeah.
least being the one of the more popular options. It is a very it's very challenging to continually open yourself up to the possibility that you're wrong, right? And
It
to live in
is.
that
Yeah.
space. It's
It's like constantly unsettling.
it is. And it's weird because to me it often feels like the more honest position for me to be in, whatever I'm like, whether I'm talking about religion or anything.
Hmm.
There's so much. I'm always like, oh man, I always feel like I'm in the gray area, like not the black or not the white, but it's like so much easier just to have this like structure of like, nope,
Yeah.
I got it. I can kind of just, I don't have to keep thinking on it. I don't have to keep mulling over it.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, which is very
And
enticing.
yeah, and I really like the way that Richard Rohr talks about this in his book Falling Upward. He talks about the
Hmm.
two, kind of first phase spirituality and second phase spirituality, and that like, 0 to 40 is the first phase. And that is the kind of certain black and white way of viewing spirituality that gives structure and gives a sense of security and kind of, identity and so on that people crave, especially when you're young.
Yeah.
You want to find your place in this world. You want to know how to do things. You want to know you're on the winning team. You want to lock in and so on. And that gives you so much structure. But then at a certain point, it starts to run out. It doesn't work anymore because you encounter real life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You encounter the inconsistencies in yourself. You encounter the hypocrisies in the world. You just experience life. And so that first day spirituality no longer is like matches to reality and to your existence. But it's hard to make that transition. And there are a lot of people that never make that transition. They just say, let's just double down and drive harder in our certainty and kind of fight harder. So it makes sense that I think that pattern is kind of constantly repeated.
It's hard to also make that transition and not just flip to the other side of like, um, you know, like, well, people who hold those beliefs, I'm angry against them, and it's wrong.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I it's very funny. I was saying in the last year or two, I've come into reading some Richard Rohr.
Oh, have
And
you really?
very funny is that I grew up in Granville, Michigan, where Rob Bell had his church.
Oh my
And
gosh. Okay.
I popped my head in a couple times, but I went to another church that was more charismatic and evangelical growing up.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
and only within like the last month did I read his a couple of his books, and I'm like, oh, oh, okay, this is really nice to hear this now. It's just very
Oh man,
interesting.
I was so judgmental towards Rob Bell, like back when he was doing his stuff and he came out with his book on hell and so on. I was just terrified of it and judgmental and super dismissive. But yeah, he was trying to get at some of these things.
Yeah, yeah. You know, here's a question for you. Um, I do you feel like there's a place, and if so, how, to like want to nudge people who are maybe very dogmatic in their religion, or maybe let me phrase this a different way. Do you feel you have the capacity to have a dialogue with people who are
Hmm.
oh, the word evades me right now, fundamentalist?
Yeah.
um or in your experience, the tides have shifted, is it a conversation that's just like too hard to hear if you're a fundamentalist of like anything else outside of that box?
Hmm.
And maybe like how
Hmm.
have you potentially navigated that?
Yeah, I think that if you're a true fundamentalist, a good fundamentalist, then the only basis of the conversation is trying to refute, correct, and
Yeah,
argue your viewpoint. And I think there are places for those kinds of debates and so on. That's all it is a debate.
yeah,
Um, I'm not really interested in that personally, and I've had some opportunities. I was invited to go on a show where someone was trying to facilitate conversations between um, Christians and non-Christians or people with radically different viewpoints. And I think that, I mean, I appreciate that desire. I appreciate that, impulse to try to facilitate those kinds of conversations.
yeah,
I think I felt like, you know what, right now, I don't necessarily want to use whatever platform I have to spotlight those voices. I'd rather have conversations with people that are open, that are exploring, that are more in the gray space
hmm,
instead of trying to go over and influence and you know argue with somebody. And I think it's just that issue that we described. There's not any space for them to say, well, I could be wrong, you know? Like I feel like I have that kind of viewpoint. In other words, if I'm talking to a Christian, I have the mindset of, you know what? I could be wrong.
yeah,
Christianity could be completely true. There
yeah,
could be a literal hell,
yeah,
and everything that the Bible teaches about God and his power could be absolutely true. I have to leave that
yes,
open, that that's a possibility. But it's hard to have a conversation with someone that doesn't have that reciprocal kind of openness.
yes.
And I think it means that it's not a true conversation per se. It is a debate. And I'm just not really interested in that right now.
It's hard because there's such an impasse there for sure. It's also interesting what you just kind of touched on too about like when you live in that gray space, you're open to all of it. Like, yeah, there could be a
Yeah.
literal hell, there could be this X, Y, and Z could be true. Like
Yeah.
I'm open to that. And it's very funny how you know sometimes that fear comes back into my life because of that.
Yeah.
My brother happens to be gay as well.
Mm.
Um, it's nice to have someone else on the same team at least. uh, and we talk about how from time to time, like that old fear will come back of like
Mm.
like guilt, or I feel bad, or blah blah blah, and then you know usually, I start re-examining, my beliefs and like, okay, listen, I've been conditioned to believe this, blah, blah, blah. But there's something about living in that gray space that
Yeah.
allows that to come back.
Yeah.
And I suppose I'm okay with that because that to me feels always more honest than living in
Mm-hmm.
the fundamental space of the opposite point of view. Like I
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally disbelieve something, but you know, we
And I think the reality is no matter where you are, you have those moments of
yeah,
doubt. Like when
yes,
you're a Christian, you have those moments too. You
yes,
might not like be honest about it or ever talk about it,
sure. You don't
but
feel you can articulate it necessarily.
yeah. But
Huh.
where those, like, what if this isn't true? What if I'm doing all this for nothing? I mean, I think there are a lot of people in churches that have those doubts and questions, maybe never voice them. I think there are a lot of people who have actually deconstructed their beliefs and no longer truly believe, but they're still showing up because it's just too disruptive to their life to voice, honestly what they actually think. And obviously there are tons of people that are closeted or people that are having affairs or doing all kinds of things and they're still in the church, but they just, they're just not actually doing it publicly.
It's been so like fun and eye opening growing up evangelical. To my husband is Southside Chicago Irish Catholic.
Oh, awesome.
And like just to get a little insight into something I never really got growing up, like West Michigan was so like Protestant evangelical, blah blah blah.
Right.
Um, it's so funny too. Even sometimes, like I'll hear his family be like, "We're not Christian, we're Catholic." I'm like, "Oh, okay, okay, all right, that makes sense." But it's just it's been such a different look into how my husband talks about religion growing up and like how different that coin is for people even underneath the same umbrella.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mean the different streams of Catholicism obviously is a massively different stream, but then even within, the Protestant tradition, there's so many different experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. Which is also just very interesting too because so many people step away from like their religious experience with such a profoundly different feeling, right? Like I
Hmm.
step away from Christianity and like I have still have a very strong affinity to the story of Jesus and the person of Jesus, right? And I
Hmm.
still have a very like open place in my heart for like like the idea of God or a benevolent being out there. Like
Hmm.
oddly walking away from like this tradition where like oh I don't feel good about like necessarily the tradition I grew up in. I still have an affinity towards
Yeah. Hmm.
some of those things about it. Whereas like my husband walked away from Catholicism and is like if you say God or anything, it's an immediate just like poof, like how it
Wow.
impacts him of like
In a negative
in
way.
very very negative way, and it's like I totally understand that. It's
Yeah.
almost odd to me that I came through that experience in that tradition and don't feel that sense of animosity.
Hmm. Yeah. I'm just learning how people's experience can be so different. We're all in process in different ways.
Yeah.
And there the ways to change your beliefs and deconstruct. There's no one way to do it. I don't think there's one right way to do it. But it's easy to, I think, at times feel like, oh, is there something wrong with me because I'm open to faith in some way, while I see others that are like actively kind of dismantling and almost reverse apologetics kind of a thing.
Yeah.
I just think we all have different stories that we're living out, and also different gifts and to use a Christian phrase, burdens. There's some people that it's really important for them to um, dismantle and kind of show what's wrong with Christian belief
Yep.
while being outside of the church, while others want to stay in the church. And even though they have so many issues with Christianity, they want to stay in and like say, you know what, this is still mine, and I'm going to work for change and reform within, and I think that's beautiful too. And others are just like wash their hands of it, like your husband. It's like, no, don't even mention it around me. We just have, just different callings, I guess.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting too, like shedding that title of a Christian or like
Yeah.
religious or blah blah blah. Like sometimes almost feels like necessary to like be able to enter a conversation with someone about where you stand, because the moment
Yeah.
like you claim to be a certain thing, there's so many like knee-jerk assumptions about what it means
Right.
you should believe or have to believe,
Yeah.
that it's very hard, to have that flexibility sometimes by even like holding on to a name or like
That's true. It's so true.
yeah.
It's amazing how we label other people and like kind of quickly try to understand them based on those labels, which I think are just so inadequate in many ways.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Johnny, like what is it? Am I understanding rightly that you are a performer in some way? Comedian?
Yeah,
Is that
yeah. So I do improv comedy. Yeah.
amazing?
Yeah, here in
Do you and your
Chicago.
husband do this together?
Luckily no. He's he's a cellist. And
Oh, incredible.
yeah, so it's great having him in the performing arts and like also myself as well, but like we each get to do our own thing.
Different wings.
He's freaking hilarious, but he's like, I don't want to do like, he doesn't have any interest in the improv world. But I teach improv comedy and sketch comedy for the Second City.
Oh, that's amazing.
It's
Oh,
so
that's so
it's
fun.
such a treat, and I performed here in Chicago before the pandemic, and
Right.
this year I've been teaching improv via Zoom, so it's been on the road. It's been a total option for it.
So you actually you have students like one-on-one type of students or group Zooms, or what does that look like?
Typically, it's a class of like about 8 people for Zoom. In-person classes would run bigger than that.
No. Right.
But yeah, Zoom is just it's a little more challenging to get through stuff
Yeah, of
with
course.
more than 8 people.
This is a funny question if you don't mind me asking,
Yeah,
but
go
do
for
you
it.
feel like you growing up around the preaching tradition and, I don't know if there were skits in youth group and that
Oh,
type of
you
thing, did
better
that in
believe it,
any way
brother.
influence your love for improv?
I don't know if it was the skits in church, but I definitely, whenever I had an outlet to perform, whether it was in church or school, like, oh, I was in, count me in.
That's
So
great.
I grew up in Assemblies of God, which has
Okay.
like a lot of like performing arts competitions and stuff like that. So I did that through there as well, and
Okay.
and then through like school, I would perform as well growing up. It's very
That's
interesting.
great.
Like I feel such a kinship to you in that like I feel like I could have taken a very similar path of like being a pastor or
Right.
being 'cause I was very fervent about my religion,
Right.
and
And you had
I'm still
public
very
gifts
fervent.
too,
I'm
right? You
still
were
very
able to stand
fervent
up in
about
front of people.
oh for sure, I guess, yeah. So that's that natural inclination to that. Um, but again, going back to that thing I was saying earlier, having that catalyst of like needing to question things more because I knew I was gay from an early age,
Yeah.
like never caused me to like take that jump, because I felt too dishonest in that jump of being
Mm-hmm.
able to say like, oh, this is what I believe. In hindsight, I'm very thankful for it that I've like, you know, got to wrestle with these things. But I feel this
Right.
kinship to people too who are like came out of this, especially the evangelical world of like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Like I could see myself in an alternate universe.
Did you like your decision to kind of no longer identify as a Christian?
Hmm.
Was that directly tied to being gay, or were those things separate? Like, in other words, was there a period of time where you were gay and you were saying, "I'm gay and I embrace my faith and I'm going to stay that way," or like how did those things intermingle?
Yes. So I would say, it's very that those things happen like, sometimes at the same time, but are two different processes, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, you know, when I was like 2021, I came out to some people in the church, like under the feeling of like sin and like
Yeah.
I gotta fix this, kind of privately. And so there was this transition from over like 10 years of like, maybe changing that identification of like Christian and not feeling like guilty about being gay. That happened at the same time because
Mm.
wrestling with both of them,
Mm-hmm.
was part of the process.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very foggy, it's almost a foggy timeline of like, you know, and like you said too, like, you can wake up on a certain day and like something can strike you a little bit more, right? Whether it's like, I feel like a little bit more like I identify with this today or don't, or, it's such an ongoing process.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense.
To live in that space.
I had
That
a
space.
I had a conversation with this amazing human. Her name is Nadia Bowles Weber, and she's a pastor, a Lutheran pastor, um, LGBTQ affirming, just speaks grace to people's shame around sex in really incredible ways. But she was having she was having a conversation with me and basically saying, I feel like people's religion is sort of like their DNA in a way that you can never truly leave it behind.
Yeah, 100%.
And I don't know, that was like, it challenged me, and it sort of irritated me. Like, yes, you can leave it behind, but I think there's something to that. I think there's something to the formative shaping explanation of reality and
Yeah.
the community and you know rituals and all those things. Even if you walk away from it, it's so ingrained. It still so shapes you. Um, and I don't know. Yeah, again, like we're talking about all the ways that can be expressed, but
Yeah.
it's still there. It's
It,
like, and I've compared it to like a native country. You move away, but you still speak the language. You still feel a kinship. You're still curious what's
yes.
happening there.
Yeah, 100%. It's very funny. Like even this idea of like my brother's boyfriend used to do like worship music or something like that. And it's just like it almost feels like a guilty pleasure to me to be like, "Oh, play such and such song." Or like, or like every once in a while we'll be on this road trip and I'll like be like, "All right, Mac, indulge me for a second. I want to find an old Christian song that I used to like listen to or something like that." And like there's that
It's comforting, right? Yeah.
it's in your DNA, and it always is in your DNA, whether like you say like, "Hey, I don't concretely identify this way or not." And there's still a very like warm-hearted part of it in my DNA of like,
Yeah.
I was noticing for maybe the first time in, oh, I don't know, it's like probably been like eight at least 8 years since I went to church regularly, maybe a decade. Um, and like during this pandemic, I was like, man, like just getting together with people on a Sunday and singing songs, isn't that fun?
So it's
And like
nice, right?
all trying to like sharpen yourself and make yourself a better person. Be like, yeah, this is what we're all doing together, right? And
Yeah.
like there's maybe food involved. It's like, of course, like you have good feelings towards that, and
Right.
like those
Yeah.
are like elemental like human things like community and singing and like getting together, and it's yeah, it's still in the DNA. It's still
Right.
like, oh yeah, I kind of miss that thing. There's been a
It's
little.
true. I think the community piece is really huge. It is such an important thing.
Do you find yourself having left the church, finding different avenues into some of those things you got before, whether it's community or whatever you may have gotten from your church experience?
I think I'm still figuring that out. And honestly, some of this is so fresh that ways that I was starting to pursue that just got completely shut down with the pandemic. So,
Yeah.
we're all trying to reacclimate to the reality of COVID and how that's going to change, in the future is really interesting to me. But I think it's probably one of the big unanswered questions for me is how do I build some of that? Because it is really important, and I want that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you were in it probably as deep as you can be in it for the majority of your
Yeah,
life, right?
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And it's definitely when that's gone, you're like, oh man, like I still, and Josh, to come back to something we were saying earlier about like, oh gosh, man, I'm so sorry. I have COVID brain, so foggy. Gosh, what were we saying? The ideas are leaving me right now as I brought it up. It's gone.
It's gone.
It's gone. I have
It's all right.
such foggy
It's
COVID brain.
it's in the COVID zone.
Yeah. Well, brother, it's so nice to get to talk to you.
Oh, this was so much fun, Johnny. I really appreciate it.
There's just like it's like as you were saying earlier about like you know, meeting people who like believe like a little bit differently. You're like, oh, it feels like this whole world opens up.
Yeah.
There's such a nice, refreshing thing about talking to people like who had the similar experiences in the church and like are wrestling with it in similar ways or tangential ways. It's just like so good to hear that.
Oh, that means a lot to me. I mean, it's funny. I have people who will, write really angry comments at times on Instagram and basically be like, why is anyone giving you a platform? You've got all these things wrong. And, basically just shut up and go away. And part of the reason that I don't is because I think there are just so many people that need to know they're not alone in this process. That they're not the only person that has changed or doesn't believe in the same way. And I think in the past, a lot of people who left the church did feel completely isolated. There was a sense of I failed. I wasn't good enough. I didn't live up to the standards. And now I'm out here, living my life, and they might be completely happy and so on, but they don't have any sense of kinship with other people. And so, I am just grateful for conversations like this where, people can just be reminded. It's like, you're not alone. You're not the only person that's gone through a major shift like this. And there's life on the other side.
And I can imagine too, being in your shoes too, where you're potentially getting it from both sides, right? Where you're getting
that's true.
The hard feedback from the religious folk and from the people who are maybe like staunchly the other way. But honestly, there's such a needed space to like have these conversations and like to have someone be open up and wear it on their sleeve a little bit, the process and the unfolding. It's incredibly valuable, Josh. And
well, thanks, Johnny. Thanks for making these kind of conversations possible. I've enjoyed it.
All right, man. Well, you have yourself a lovely day.
You too. Take care of yourself and enjoy that van and get healthy, buddy.
Man, we're so excited. Tomorrow we're going back home, and
oh, that's awesome.
We can't.
That's
wait.
Really good. It was great to meet you, and let's stay in touch. I'd love to get to Chicago sometime and see you perform. That'd be so much fun.
Yeah, and then let us know if you're headed this way or if we're in the van and moving towards Vancouver.
All right,
once
absolutely.
The borders open.
There's some great spots for your van to camp alongside the beach and stuff.
Are you an outdoorsy person?
I'm actually growing in that. That's one of my goals is to hike more and just enjoy all of it more.
Yeah, there's so much over there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. It's pretty
incredible.
Awesome. All right, have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Dance to the middle of the night. Come on. Dance appetite. Dance to the middle of the night. Come on, dance. Wake up the appetite. Dance to the middle of the night. Come on, dance. Wake up the appetite. Dance to the middle of the night. Come on, dance. Wake up the appetite. Dance to the middle of the night. Yeah.